When German troops first encountered the American M4 Sherman tank, they laughed. To them, it was a clumsy-looking machine, tall, awkward, with armor that couldn't match the thick steel hide of their Panthers or the terrifying long-barreled Tigers. To the German tank commanders who prided themselves on precision and engineering perfection, the Sherman looked like a toy. But what they didn't know, what they could never have known, was that the true power of the Sherman tank wasn't just in its gun or armor. It was in its voice, the voice carried through the static of the world's most advanced radio system. And that invisible network of sound, coordination, and command would change the course of tank warfare forever. In the early years of World War II, communication on the battlefield was chaos. German panzer divisions relied on radio, yes, but most of their lower-level vehicles didn't have transmitters, only receivers. Orders could be given down, but not sent back up. Crews had to rely on hand signals, colored flags, or sometimes even the madness of running messages through artillery fire. The Germans, despite their mechanical superiority, were often fighting blind. But on the other side of the Atlantic, the Americans had been quietly working on something that didn't shine or roar. Engineers at companies like RCA, Motorola, and Western Electric were building a communication system so advanced that it would become the unseen backbone of the U.S. armored forces. By 1942, every single Sherman tank rolled off the assembly line with a two-way radio, a full transceiver system that allowed tank commanders to talk to each other, to infantry, to artillery, and even to air support above them. It was a web of instant coordination that no other army on Earth could match at that time. On the battlefield, this meant the difference between life and death. While German tank units had to rely on pre-planned maneuvers and limited signals, American tank commanders could adapt instantly. Imagine a Sherman platoon moving through the hedgerows of Normandy, visibility limited, danger everywhere. A single radio call from a scout tank at the front could warn the entire formation of an ambush ahead. Within seconds, the tanks behind would fan out, flank, and return fire with coordinated precision. To the Germans watching this unfold, it seemed like the Americans were reading their minds, reacting with impossible speed. But it wasn't telepathy. It was technology. It was radio. German crews, on the other hand, were often trapped in silence. Inside a Tiger or Panther, the commander had to shout over the roar of the Maybach engine, over the clanging shells and grinding treads. Their tanks were powerful, yes, but they were isolated fortresses. If a Tiger was knocked out or immobilized, nearby tanks often didn't even know until it was too late. Communication between tanks in the same unit depended heavily on visual signals or direct line-of-sight shouting. The Germans ha. The Americans understood something the Germans underestimated: a tank's greatest strength wasn't always its armor, it was teamwork. A single Sherman might be vulnerable in a one-on-one fight against a Tiger, but 10 Shermans working in perfect communication could outmaneuver, surround, and destroy that Tiger before it could react. That was the American doctrine: mobility, coordination, and overwhelming communication. The radios turned every Sherman crew into part of a living, thinking organism. The commander wasn't just a fighter, he was a node in a network, listening, responding, relaying information. Orders came alive over the crackle of static, short, clipped messages that carried the rhythm of modern mechanized warfare. Enemy armor ahead at 2 o'clock, adjust bearing. Flank left. Hold position for airstrike. These weren't just words. They were the heartbeat of victory. It was during the North African campaign that the power of these radios became truly apparent. American tank forces under General Patton moved across open desert landscapes that demanded constant coordination. Sandstorms, heat haze, and blinding light made visibility nearly impossible, but the radios never failed. Sherman commanders could coordinate flanking maneuvers over miles of terrain. When German forces under Rommel tried their classic blitzkrieg tactics, expecting confusion and delay, they were met instead with lightning-fast American responses. Shermans appeared in places they shouldn't have, cut off supply lines, and outmaneuvered superior German armor. The Germans began to notice something unnerving: American tanks seemed to know where they were going before they even got there. That illusion of omniscience came from the airwaves. By the time of the Normandy invasion, this network had evolved into a masterpiece of battlefield communication. Every tank platoon had not only inter-vehicle radios but also link-ups with artillery observers and infantry units carrying portable SCR-300 backpack radios. For the first time in warfare, tanks, infantry, and artillery could coordinate in real time. A Sherman could call in an airstrike or artillery barrage within minutes. If German tanks tried to break through, Sherman crews could radio nearby anti-tank guns for support. And as the Americans pushed through the bocage country of France, that coordination became their deadliest weapon. The Germans, with their superior armor, found themselves ambushed, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed not by numbers alone, but by communication. The secret to this technological edge lay in American industrial genius. While Germany's war industry was focused on high-performance machines that were often over-engineered and slow to produce, the United States was focused on reliability and scale. The SCR-508 and SCR-528 radio systems used in Shermans were mass-produced, easy to maintain, and incredibly durable. They could operate in extreme conditions, sand, mud, snow, and still transmit clear signals over miles. German radios, though sophisticated, were prone to overheating, interference, and complex tuning. American crews could swap out a damaged radio in minutes. The Germans had to send theirs back to depots for repairs. Every detail of the Sherman's communication system was designed for simplicity and effectiveness, reflecting the broader philosophy of American wartime production: build it fast, make it work, and make sure every soldier can use it. To the German soldiers on the receiving end, this invisible power was terrifying. They couldn't hear the voices that coordinated the American advance, but they could see its effects. One moment they'd be firing at a group of Shermans, the next, those tanks would vanish, only to reappear on their flank or rear. Artillery would start landing exactly where they'd repositioned moments earlier. It felt supernatural. German commanders began reporting that the Americans were somehow predicting their moves, but in truth, it was the precision of live communication. The radio turned chaos into order, confusion into strategy. It was as if every Sherman tank carried not just a gun, but a mind that could think collectively. Even in the final months of the war, when Germany's tank forces were fighting a desperate retreat through Europe, this difference remained. The Americans kept improving their radio systems, integrating better frequencies, encryption methods, and voice clarity. By contrast, German units often suffered from jamming, signal overlap, and power shortages. In the Battle of the Bulge, when fog and weather grounded aircraft, it was the Sherman's radio coordination that held the American lines together. Tank units, cut off and surrounded, stayed in the fight because they could still talk, still share enemy positions, still call for reinforcements. The radios kept the American armored spearhead alive even when everything else was falling apart. What the Germans never realized was that by the end of the war, the American radio network had effectively turned the Sherman army into a single giant machine. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of artillery pieces, and squadrons of fighter bombers all linked by invisible signals, a web of steel and sound. The enemy might have had thicker armor, bigger guns, or more fearsome names, but the Americans had something the Germans couldn't match: the power of connection. Every order, every call for support, every adjustment in formation, all of it was carried by a voice traveling through the static, shaping victory in real time. When the war finally ended and German officers were interviewed, many admitted their surprise. They had assumed American tank success came from sheer numbers or air power. Few had any idea about the role of the radios inside each Sherman. To them, it was unimaginable that an army could equip every tank with such communication power. And yet, that invisible technology had done what armor-piercing shells and high-velocity guns could not: it gave the Americans an unbreakable unity on the battlefield. The story of the Sherman's radio system is a reminder that in war, not every weapon makes noise. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is silence, or rather, the silence between voices speaking in perfect coordination. The Germans built tanks to dominate in single combat. The Americans built theirs to fight as one. And in that difference, history was decided. The summer of 1944 was a nightmare for the German army. From the beaches of Normandy to the rolling fields of France, the once unstoppable Wehrmacht found itself outmaneuvered, outflanked, and outthought. They faced not just an army, but a machine of coordination, speed, and relentless communication. The Americans called it combined arms warfare, but to the men inside the Sherman tanks, it was something simpler: trust in the voice crackling through their headsets. Every commander, every gunner, every driver could hear the heartbeat of the battle, the voices of their brothers in arms, the commands that stitched chaos into precision. And that heartbeat was carried on the most advanced radio network the world had ever seen. As the Shermans rolled through the hedgerows after D-Day, they found themselves in one of the most difficult terrains imaginable. Narrow lanes, tall earthen walls covered in thick greenery, and blind corners that turned every advance into an ambush. German anti-tank guns, especially the deadly 88mm, lurked behind every hedge. The Americans learned quickly that charging forward blindly was suicide. But then something remarkable began to happen: they started to adapt in real time. Each Sherman tank became both a weapon and a messenger. The lead tank would report enemy contact over the radio: Panzerfaust on the left hedge. Incoming fire, 200 yards ahead. Within seconds, every Sherman in the formation would know. Infantry units moving alongside them could tune into those same frequencies through their portable SCR-300 radios. Artillery commanders in the rear would listen and adjust their guns. The result was coordination so fluid, so immediate, that the Germans couldn't understand how their positions were being hit moments after firing a single shot. To a German gun crew manning an 88 in the bocage, it seemed like black magic. They would fire once, maybe twice, and then, boom, shells would rain down precisely on their location. They had no idea that dozens of Sherman commanders, all connected by radio, were triangulating their position the moment that first flash appeared. The Germans were masters of precision gunnery, but the Americans had mastered information. And information, in modern warfare, is deadlier than any gun. Inside the Sherman, the radio was more than a machine, it was a lifeline. The commander's voice echoed in the crew's headsets, relaying not just orders but emotion, urgency, the pulse of the battle itself. Driver, forward. Gunner, traverse left. Enemy armor ahead. These words, transmitted through the static, became the rhythm of survival. And beyond the immediate crew, there was a chorus of other voices: the platoon leader coordinating flanks, the infantry lieutenant calling for tank support, the artillery observer requesting fire missions. All of them connected, all of them alive in the same instant. For the first time in military history, an entire army could act as one synchronized organism, guided not by flags or messengers, but by sound. This radio web transformed even the way Sherman crews thought. In training, American tankers were taught not to act alone. A Sherman was never meant to duel a Tiger one-on-one, it was meant to hunt in packs. Talk, move, and cover each other, instructors repeated. In practice, this doctrine became unstoppable. When one Sherman spotted a target, it didn't just engage, it told everyone. Tiger at 10 o'clock. Within seconds, flanking tanks would reposition, infantry would shift, and air support could be summoned. To the Germans, it looked like perfect coordination, like the Americans had rehearsed every move. But in truth, it was happening live, moment by moment, through the voices in the ether. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. German radio systems, though advanced in theory, were hampered by production shortages and overcomplication. The FUG-5, their standard tank radio, required delicate tuning and careful calibration. It was effective, when it worked, but in the chaos of combat, it was fragile. Dust, mud, and shock from firing could throw it off frequency. American SCR radios, on the other hand, were built like tractors, tough, simple, and reliable. They operated on preset channels, so switching frequencies was as easy as turning a knob. Maintenance was minimal, and spare parts were plentiful. When a radio failed, crews could swap it out within minutes. That reliability gave American tank units a continuous, unbroken voice across the battlefield, a voice that never went silent. By the time the Allies broke out from Normandy and surged toward Paris, the Sherman radio network had evolved into a full battlefield intelligence system. Reconnaissance jeeps and armored cars equipped with radios scouted ahead, relaying enemy positions to tank columns miles behind. Forward observers in aircraft could talk directly to ground units, guiding them toward German convoys. In one famous incident near St. Lo, a group of Sherman commanders coordinated an entire armored ambush using nothing but radio chatter, trapping a German panzer column in a narrow valley. The engagement lasted less than 15 minutes. Every move was communicated, every shot synchronized. When it was over, the German column lay in ruins, destroyed not just by firepower, but by precision coordination. That same coordination would later prove decisive in the largest land battle fought by the U.S. Army, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, when German forces launched their surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes, chaos reigned. Snow and fog grounded Allied aircraft, cutting off the usual advantage of air reconnaissance. Roads were clogged, visibility near zero, and communication lines were collapsing under the strain. But once again, the Sherman's radios became the savior of the battlefield. Tank crews trapped behind enemy lines could still communicate with nearby units, sharing enemy movements and ambush locations. In Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, American tankers used their radios to direct artillery and coordinate resupply drops from the air. Even isolated platoons, cut off by the German advance, stayed in the fight because they could still talk, still hear that reassuring crackle of command on the other end. To the Germans, the American ability to coordinate under such conditions seemed impossible. Their own radios, hampered by the cold and interference, often failed. Commanders lost contact with their subordinate units for hours or even days. Orders went missing. Confusion spread. Meanwhile, the Shermans, though battered and outgunned, kept moving in unison. Their radios turned pockets of resistance into cohesive defensive webs. In one instance near the town of Foy, 3 isolated Sherman platoons managed to encircle and destroy an entire column of German armored cars simply by coordinating over the air. They shared positions, called out firing angles, and moved like a single mind. The Germans had no idea they were fighting a small, cut-off force, because the radios made them fight like a division. This invisible weapon, this network of sound, didn't just win battles, it reshaped the psychology of the American tank crews. They trusted that they were never truly alone. No matter how thick the smoke, how loud the shells, or how desperate the situation, that voice in the headset meant someone was listening. It gave them courage, direction, and calm in the heart of chaos. German veterans later recalled how unnerving it was to face such an enemy. The Americans always seemed to appear at the right place, at the right time, one captured panzer commander said. It was as if they could see through the fog. But the Americans didn't need to see through the fog, they could talk through it. By 1945, the Sherman's radio system had evolved even further. Newer models incorporated improved frequency stability, allowing direct coordination with fighter bombers in real time. For the first time, tank commanders could mark targets for airstrikes with smoke shells and then radio nearby P-47 Thunderbolts to attack those exact coordinates. This integration of air and armor was revolutionary, and devastating. During the final push into Germany, Shermans and aircraft worked together like clockwork, breaking apart German strongholds that had once been thought impenetrable. The Tiger tank, once the terror of the battlefield, became a trapped giant. Wherever it moved, the Shermans would follow. Not blindly, but guided by constant communication, supported by air power that arrived with surgical precision. Even in the ruins of Germany's cities, the radios kept the American war machine humming. Urban warfare demanded coordination between tanks, infantry, and engineers clearing obstacles. The ability to relay messages instantly turned what could have been a nightmare into a synchronized assault. While German defenders shouted orders through rubble and confusion, American tank infantry teams advanced with methodical unity, clearing buildings one by one, calling for artillery when needed, and moving only when every unit was ready. The radio turned every Sherman from a simple machine into a node of command, an extension of a massive, living intelligence. When the war finally ended, the full scope of this technological advantage became clear. Captured German officers were stunned to learn that every single Sherman, tens of thousands of them, had come equipped with two-way radios as standard. For years, the Germans had assumed that only command tanks carried such systems. The idea that an entire armored army could communicate freely, instantly, and securely was unthinkable. They had relied on superior armor and firepower, but they had fought a disconnected war. The Americans, with their humble, mass-produced Shermans, had built a connected war, one where information moved faster than steel, and decisions were made in seconds, not hours. Historians often call the Sherman the tank that won the war, and while many point to its reliability or numbers, the truth lies deeper. The Sherman's greatest weapon wasn't its gun, it was its radio. It turned thousands of individual machines into a single, coordinated organism. It made the difference between chaos and control, between guesswork and precision. And perhaps most importantly, it embodied a uniquely American approach to warfare, teamwork, adaptability, and innovation. The Germans never knew, never even imagined, that every time they faced a Sherman, they were facing not one tank, but the voice of an entire army behind it. That unseen network of sound would become the blueprint for modern mechanized warfare, where information is as vital as firepower. And as the smoke cleared over Europe in 1945, one truth became undeniable: the Sherman's radio didn't just carry voices. It carried victory. By the winter of 1945, Europe was a continent shattered by fire and fear. Cities lay in ruins, bridges collapsed, and the German army, once the embodiment of precision and power, was retreating on every front. Yet amid the smoke and chaos, one sound cut through the static of war: the calm, steady voices of American tank commanders carried through the airwaves of the Sherman's radios. That sound, organized, confident, unbroken, was the sound of control. It was the rhythm of an army that no longer stumbled or hesitated. It was the heartbeat of victory. When the Allied armies reached the western banks of the Rhine River, the German High Command believed they had one last chance to hold back the inevitable. The Rhine was more than a river, it was a barrier, a symbol, a final wall that Hitler declared impassable. Every bridge was rigged with explosives, every approach fortified. German troops dug in along the eastern bank, waiting for the thunder of American engines. What they didn't know was that the real American weapon wasn't just rolling on treads, it was whispering through the ether. The radio network inside the Shermans would soon turn one of the most difficult river crossings in military history into a synchronized masterpiece of coordination. In early March 1945, the U.S. First Army approached Remagen, a small town nestled along a bend of the Rhine. A reconnaissance unit, equipped with radios linked directly to Sherman columns miles behind, spotted something miraculous: the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. German engineers had failed to destroy it completely. The information flashed across the radio net in seconds. Sherman units under General William Hogue's Combat Command B received the call, and within minutes, tanks, engineers, and infantry began converging on the site. There was no time for written orders, no delay for messenger relays. Every move, every tank positioning, every artillery cover order, was spoken, acknowledged, and acted upon through the Sherman's radios. German defenders on the far side were stunned by the speed of the American response. They had expected confusion, delay, hesitation. Instead, Shermans were appearing on the hillsides, firing smoke shells to cover advancing infantry, directing engineers over the bridge even as artillery rained down. The Americans didn't fight like a chaotic mob, they fought like a single entity, an army with one mind and one voice. In the heat of battle, even as explosions rocked the bridge and cables snapped, Sherman crews maintained constant radio contact. Smoke right bank. Cover engineers. Tiger across the river, engage from left flank. The airwaves buzzed with life, carrying courage and coordination across a river that Hitler had sworn no enemy would ever cross. By nightfall, the Americans held the bridge. The Rhine had been breached, not by brute force, but by communication. Across the collapsing German front, similar stories unfolded. At every stage, the Sherman's radios became the nerve system of an advancing giant. When the 3rd Armored Division pushed toward Cologne, they faced desperate resistance from German Panthers and anti-tank guns hidden among the rubble. The fighting was brutal, house to house, block by block. Yet even in the narrow streets of Cologne, where visibility was reduced to a few dozen meters, Sherman commanders never lost contact with each other. Platoon leaders used their radios to call in supporting fire, coordinate flanking routes through side streets, and even direct aerial attacks from P-47 Thunderbolts orbiting overhead. One of the most famous tank duels of the war occurred here, an American Sherman facing off against a German Panther near the Cologne Cathedral. The Panther had superior range and firepower, but the Americans had awareness. As the Panther moved into position, a forward observer radioed its coordinates. Within seconds, the Sherman crew knew exactly where the enemy was. They maneuvered through the wreckage, coordinated with a nearby unit for crossfire, and struck. The battle was caught on film by Signal Corps cameramen, and when the footage reached audiences back home, few realized they were watching not just courage, but communication in action. That single victory was the product of countless invisible voices working in harmony. For the German soldiers fighting in those final months, the experience was increasingly surreal. They faced an enemy that seemed omnipresent, always coordinated, always one step ahead. The Americans talked too much, one German radio operator wrote bitterly in his diary, but it works. He wasn't wrong. The Americans did talk constantly, radio discipline was drilled into every Sherman crew, but that chatter was the sound of precision. It meant no unit fought blind. When a Sherman spotted a threat, every other tank in the formation knew about it instantly. When infantry were pinned down, they could radio the nearest tank for support. The result was devastating synergy. As the Allies surged deeper into Germany, the Sherman's radio system expanded into a continent-wide communication web. Tank commanders were no longer isolated warriors, they were mobile transmitters in a living network that linked divisions, corps, and air commands. A single observation from a Sherman on a back road in the Ruhr Valley could trigger an artillery barrage or airstrike miles away. American commanders could move whole armored divisions with the speed of thought, thanks to the voices whispering through their radios. The psychological effect of this invisible power cannot be overstated. To American soldiers, the radio meant safety. It meant connection. Crews trapped in burning tanks could still call for rescue, platoons lost in fog or darkness could find their way home. In an era before satellite links or GPS, that ability to talk, to know, was revolutionary. To the Germans, on the other hand, it was terrifying. Their once disciplined formations began to crumble under the constant pressure of coordinated Allied strikes. Every time they regrouped, the Americans seemed to know. Every time they tried to counterattack, they ran into ambushes. The radio had turned warfare from a contest of strength into a contest of information, and the Germans were on the losing side. By April 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine in force. The Sherman's radio became a tool not only of destruction but of mercy. Tank commanders used it to coordinate the evacuation of civilians, direct medical convoys, and prevent friendly fire in the chaos of urban combat. Communication brought clarity to a battlefield drowning in confusion. And even as the war drew to its brutal end, the voice of the Sherman remained calm and steady. Advance to checkpoint, hold fire, cease fire. Short, clipped words, but behind them, the discipline and unity of an entire army. When the Americans finally reached the Elbe River and made contact with Soviet forces coming from the east, the war in Europe was effectively over. The Germans, exhausted and broken, laid down their arms. But even in surrender, they were curious. Many asked to see the inside of a Sherman tank. They wanted to understand how these machines, seemingly so inferior in armor and firepower, had triumphed. When they saw the radios, the shock was visible. "Every tank?" one German officer asked in disbelief. "Every single one." The American sergeant nodded. "Yes, every single one." That moment captured the essence of the technological divide that had defined the war. The Germans had built tanks for the duel, for single combat between armored beasts. The Americans had built tanks for the team, for the orchestra of combined arms where every unit played a part. The radio was the conductor's baton, turning thousands of separate voices into a symphony of steel. In those final days, as columns of Shermans rolled through shattered German towns, their antennas waved like black flags in the wind, symbols of a new kind of warfare. Children watched from ruins as the tanks passed, their radios still alive with chatter. "Keep moving. Bridge ahead secure. No resistance in sector." The war had been won not just by courage or firepower, but by connection, by an invisible thread of sound linking men who might never see each other, but who fought as one. The legacy of that network would echo far beyond 1945. Future armies would study the American radio system as the blueprint for modern mechanized warfare. But in that moment, amid the rubble, the smoke, the broken bridges, the Sherman's radios had done something far greater than win a war. They had shown that in the age of machines, the most powerful weapon of all was still the human voice. As the guns of Europe began to fall silent in the spring of 1945, a strange and almost sacred quiet settled over the battlefields that had once thundered with fire. The cities that had shaken under tank tracks and bombing raids now echoed only with wind and memory. For the American soldiers who had survived that long and terrible march, from the sands of North Africa, through the hedgerows of Normandy, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany, the war had been more than a struggle for land. It had been a test of coordination, of unity, of belief in one another. And at the center of that unity, humming quietly even as the world burned around it, was the voice of the Sherman's radio. To the men who fought inside those tanks, the sound of that radio was more than static or signal, it was home. It was the comfort of knowing they were never alone. Through blizzards, through firestorms, through the deafening roar of artillery, that steady crackle in the headset meant someone was out there, another crew, another voice, another beating heart of the same great army. The Germans had built machines that could dominate in single combat, but the Americans had built machines that could communicate. And as the final battles of World War II came to an end, that difference defined everything. When American forces entered the shattered ruins of Berlin in April 1945, alongside the thunderous advance of the Soviets, it was the end of a nightmare that had consumed the world. German soldiers, once the pride of Europe's most feared war machine, surrendered in droves. Many of them were bewildered, their eyes hollow, their uniforms tattered. They spoke of being overwhelmed, surrounded, and defeated by an enemy that seemed to move faster than sound itself. "They always knew where we were," one German tanker admitted after his capture. "Every time we tried to regroup, their tanks were already waiting. It was as if they had eyes everywhere. But those eyes were not magic. They were the result of 1,000 unseen connections, the invisible web of Sherman radios that stretched across continents and oceans, linking tank to tank, platoon to division, soldier to strategy. That network was the bloodstream of the Allied war effort. It carried not just words but coordination, courage, and command. Without it, the Sherman might have been just another tank, useful, reliable, but ordinary. With it, the Sherman became a force multiplier, a battlefield conductor orchestrating the largest mechanized movement in human history. In the final months, as Allied columns thundered eastward through the German heartland, the radios played their final symphony. Tank commanders guided convoys of refugees out of danger zones, engineers used radio frequencies to synchronize bridge repairs under fire, and field hospitals received life-saving information through the same networks that once guided shells. Even as destruction surrounded them, the radio carried not only commands of war but acts of mercy. Soldiers who had grown used to the noise of battle found comfort in the sound of communication, a lifeline that spoke of discipline and hope. When the shooting finally stopped, and the Sherman tanks stood silent in the fields they had conquered, many crews found it hard to switch off their radios. Some let them hum softly, unable to bear the silence after years of voices. In those moments, the static that filled their headsets was like the echo of everything they had survived, the chaos, the camaraderie, the unity. The war had been won not only with guns, but with connection. The radio had turned countless individuals into one heartbeat. For historians, the Sherman success is often reduced to numbers, more than 49,000 built, serving in every theater, produced faster than any tank in history. But numbers don't tell the story of what made the Sherman unstoppable. Its armor could be pierced, its gun could be outmatched, and yet it rolled on, because it fought as part of something larger. Its radio turned it from a machine into a communicator, a messenger of movement and intent. The Germans never fully understood that they were not fighting tanks, they were fighting an idea, that communication could defeat isolation, that teamwork could overpower technology. In those last battles across the Elbe and into Bavaria, this truth became undeniable. When German counterattacks threatened isolated American positions, it was the Sherman's radio nets that saved them. Within seconds, calls for reinforcements could reach artillery batteries miles away. Air support could be summoned from above, and infantry could realign instantly. The speed of American coordination was not just tactical, it was revolutionary. The Germans had once pioneered the idea of blitzkrieg, lightning war, but now they faced something faster than lightning itself, information. That invisible current of communication flowed from the smallest scout tank to the highest headquarters. Generals like Patton and Bradley relied on those networks to command armies with unprecedented precision. Reports from the front, transmitted through Sherman crews, shaped every move of the Allied campaign. In the past, generals had waited hours for runners or telegraph updates. Now they received voice transmissions from the heart of combat. The battlefield had become alive with sound, a symphony of coordination that no other army on earth could match. For the German soldiers caught in that storm, defeat came not only from overwhelming numbers but from confusion. They found themselves outmaneuvered, their communications jammed or cut, their orders delayed by hours. A tank commander might wait for instructions that never came, while American Shermans around him operated like a living organism, every voice feeding into the next, every move anticipating the enemy's. The psychological toll was immense. They were ghosts, a German officer recalled. They spoke through the air. We could not see them, but they surrounded us. Even after Germany's surrender, when Allied troops began to occupy towns and villages, the same technology that had brought destruction now brought order. American armored units used their radios to coordinate reconstruction, manage logistics, and prevent violence in the power vacuum left by the Nazi collapse. The same frequencies that had once directed artillery now carried words of relief: food convoy incoming, civilian evacuation complete, ceasefire confirmed. It was as if the radio itself had transformed from an instrument of war into a tool of peace. Among the soldiers returning home, the memory of that sound, the constant voice in their ear, stayed with them forever. Many veterans later said the hardest part of leaving the battlefield was the silence that followed. They had lived for years in a chorus of voices, their commanders, their comrades, the ever-present hum of coordination. The silence of peace felt lonely by comparison. Yet within that silence lay the legacy of what those voices had achieved. The Sherman's radio didn't just help win battles, it changed the way wars would be fought forever. Future military planners studied its network, realizing that control of communication was control of the battlefield. The lesson was simple but eternal: whoever could talk fastest, coordinate most clearly, and act most decisively would win. The radio had given the Allies not only an advantage, it had given them the blueprint for modern warfare. But beyond technology, the Sherman's radio represented something deeper: trust. Every word sent through those frequencies was a bond between men who might never meet but who depended on each other completely. In the chaos of combat, that trust was everything. It meant that a tank crew could drive through enemy fire because they believed the voice guiding them. It meant that an infantryman pinned behind a wall could call for help and know someone would answer. That web of voices created an unbreakable brotherhood, a unity that outlasted the war itself.